Hello there. In this session, we'll be talking about 360, VR, and AR. It's on everyone's lips today, it's the in thing, and there's no way I can cover that sort of ground in 20 minutes. What I'm going to try and do is provide some context, give you a little bit of background, and deal with some of the terminology that we would encounter in this field. And let's have some fun in the process. It was 1992. I was invited by the digital guru Nicholas Negroponte to visit the MIT Media Lab in Boston. I took with me this little girl, Hamida Akhtar Brishti, and we turned up at the MIT Media Lab. I was going to run a workshop with Professor Simon Pepper, who was the professor of creative learning at MIT. Brishti was a 10-year-old. It was the first time she'd left the country, the first time she'd been on a plane. It was completely different territory for her. One would assume that she was the one who'd be mesmerized by what was going on. But it was me, who behaved like the 10-year-old. As we walked into that place, there was a person dancing, but she was dancing in a space which was in some way generating music along with her movement. It was some sort of a spatial audio response, which I had never come across before. And then as we walked through the lab, there was this person with goggles, a little bit like this, but bigger, I suspect. And he was walking around the lab a bit like a robot. I didn't know what it was, and certainly VR was not a terminology that was known at that time. But that's what's being done. That's the research they were doing. That was 1992. Nearly 30 years later, it's a very different world today, and that's what we'll be talking about. We are storytellers, we're journalists. We try and bring people into our story. We try and make our stories immersive in the sense that we try and get people a sense of being where the story is happening. That's what we are able to do at our best. But there are people who've done it before. The African griot is so skilled at doing it. They've not needed VR, they've not needed any of the technical tools, but they had that ability. Perhaps some of us have that ability, most of us don't. We use tools and we use devices, and that's what VR helps us to do. So someone like this person in Manikganj in Bangladesh would be sitting in an open place under a tree with people all around, and they would transport us to the world that they were talking about. We try and do that through the stories that we tell, through the mechanisms that we use. We try and put people, we try and put ourselves in their shoes and take them to where we are. There was a very important VR production done by the UN. It was about Syria. It was about Syrian refugees. And one of the comments I heard was, you feel as if you can smell the bread being baked in front of you at the camp's bakery. With all that turmoil, with all that chaos, there is that sense, even a sense of smell that can come across. And I will show you some of those videos, but let's begin with showing a little clip. What we're looking at is a VR 360 drive through New York City. And as I move this way or that way using those little arrows, I can go around. I can even drag things along. Essentially, I'm on this van and I'm looking over it. I can peer up into the sky. I can look down. I can move around like this. And it gives me a sense of being there, looking around, turning my head, doing all the things a normal viewer would do. But if I were to show you the video as it's downloaded, yes, you could. It's running now, and at the moment, actually, it's parked. But you see this strange view. I mean, it has all the information, but it doesn't really appear realistic. The other video that I showed you on YouTube has a far greater semblance of what we might expect had we actually been there. Now, let me move it around, and this is happening as the video is playing. So things are moving while all this is happening. There's nothing static here. Yeah, the bus is moving, the people are walking, and I can still turn it around. But this is only one of the many variations, and I will move back now. I'm just using this as a point of reference. I will move back now to talk about the various tools and how they're placed and where within our lexicon we find them. The video that you saw would have been taken by devices such as this, which is a 360 VR device, fairly simple. It could be seen with a device such as this, or even something as simple as this, which is but basically a cardboard box with some lenses. And you would put your mobile phone in there and watch it, provided you have the right app, you would get that sort of an effect. And there's a complete range. You could have very sophisticated devices to see it or something of this sort. And they all give you an experience at some level of what's happening. But I would like to show you this statement by Ban Ki-moon, the Secretary General of the United Nations. I'll read it out to you. Last night, I saw a deeply moving video entitled Clouds over Sidra. It was an amazing virtual reality production of the starkness of life in the Zaatari refugee camp through the eyes of a beautiful young girl by the name of Sidra. This is one person's response, but it is a powerful response that this technology can elicit. And rather than going into that technology, we will talk a little bit about how we find it being used. A large part of virtual reality usage is in the field of gaming. But there are very important things that happen outside of gaming, and those are the things we'll talk about. Educational apps, medical training, architectural visualization, military simulation, promotional installation, amusement park rides, retail users, and of course, relevant for us, journalism and storytelling. So those are the areas we'll be looking at. I want to take you back a little bit. In the early 80s, I used to make holograms. And the first time I made a transmission hologram, it was a little rabbit that I photographed. And then I removed the rabbit, I turned on my laser beams, and there in front of me was that rabbit again. It was an incredible experience for me. I looked around it, I went up, went down, went close, went far. I tried to touch it. It was as if the real thing was there. And the essential difference was not only the fact that it looked real, but it had the characteristics and it had the information that the real thing would have done. And I'll use this to give you an idea of what I'm talking about. First, I'll come up with an image. Let me see if I can dig it up quickly. Oh, Face ID, I can't do that. Yeah, that is a dog looking at a window. This one, yeah? Okay, so you're seeing it now, and this dog is trying to sit close to the window because it wants to look out, it wants to look aside, up, it's curious. The thing is, if I move back from the window, I see less of what's around. My field of view gets curtailed. If I go right up, I can see a lot more. Now this actually is exactly what a hologram allows you to do by containing that information. Let's assume this was a hologram. Yeah? Now, if I covered up the window of the hologram with cardboard like this, I would only see a small amount from that little window. But if I got my eye really close, as I'm doing now, I could see all the thing outside through that little hole. I will only be able to see it from that particular viewpoint, but I would actually see that entire space. And that's one of the beauties of a hologram. If you tear a hologram and take a little bit, that little bit will give you that entire view from that particular perspective. And in a sense, there's a lot of similarity with VR, because it allows that information. There is a difference between holography and photography. Photography is image modulated, holography is phase modulated. It holds the information and not the image itself. And in a sense, we looked at the two videos earlier on. The main video file was not really very useful for us. It's when it went through a particular player, a particular mechanism, that we were able to see it as we would. Now, there is another important aspect when it comes to VR. As you will notice, there are two lenses, and they're separated. And it is important that the two lenses are separated, because that gives you stereo vision. And it is stereo vision that creates the illusion of 3D, the distance. Our brain translates the two different images that come to our two different eyes and calculates for us what would be the three-dimensional image. That's what we see. So within VR, those are very important things. Stereoscopic vision is very important. You will come across three terms: virtual reality, augmented reality, and augmented virtuality, which is somewhere in the middle. We will go through those very briefly. Essentially, altogether, it's a viewer-centric perspective. You are seeing what you're seeing from the perspective of the viewer. You have placed that viewer in the middle of your frame. And if you've done it well, for the viewer, you've replaced the real world. So it's that real-time interaction with the environment around that is the joy of VR, of augmented reality, because it gives you a feeling that conventional imagery simply cannot do. So there are some other things you need to remember. One is ambisonic sound. Now, I'm not sure whether we did it earlier or later, but we talked about, in the introductory program, we talked to DJ Clark, and we saw his multimedia program, which won the first prize at World Press and has been winning prizes everywhere. Now, he talks in the guest lecture that we do, he talks about ambisonic sound. Now, when I hear things, I hear something from my left ear, I hear something from my right ear. If something was going to happen on this side, I would hear it more from this ear than with this, and I would sense it is from that side. If that sound moved to the other side, it's my right ear that would hear it better than my left ear, and because of that difference, my brain would be able to work out. Even when I'm not seeing the sound, I know where it's coming from. I know whether it's coming from the left or the right or up or down, because my brain is able to analyze, because of the stereoscopic sound that I get, where it is positioned. Now, a problem happens when we're working in virtual VR. Let's assume that we have these two speakers and the sound is stereophonic as I'm listening. But when I turn around, the source of the sound needs to change, because relative to me, the source of the sound is no longer as it was. If the sound is static, I will not get the same feeling. While my visuals might change, the audio will give it away. So you now need a mechanism where you work with a sound field rather than sound being mapped to each channel. And that's ambisonic sound, and that's one of the things we'll need to look at. Let's move on. There is a thing called field of view. We know of field of vision, depth of field, and all those sort of things. Field of view is when you're looking ahead, and let me read it out. Field of view is the extent of your natural vision, both in reality and in MX content. The average human field of view is approximately 200 degrees. We must remember that's 200 degrees with both eyes. Each eye does not have 200 degrees, but with the two eyes I can sort of see something like this, quite wide. I don't focus on everything out there, but I can see both hands at the same time. Yeah. Now, with good VR, it's, I suppose, 90 to 110 degrees, gives you a decent enough experience for enjoying VR. That's one of the things we need to think about. But our devices need to be able to do this. We have field of view, we have field of regard. Now I'll read out again. A field of regard covers a space user can see from a given position, including when moving eyes, head, and neck. So I'm here. I can look up, I can look down, I can move my head, I can turn around. All that I'm possibly able to see is my field of regard, yeah, from that particular position. There is something else which is interesting. It's called the frustum culling, and it's a fancy term. But effectively what it does is it limits how much information is being provided to you. Because, yes, I'm looking at you now, and I'm sitting here in the studio looking at these cameras staring at me. I've got these devices in front of me. If I were to do a VR which would take everything from my eye right to there would be information overload. It would make it very difficult for the people rendering it to have all of that in the detail that I need. So they deliberately leave out things which they think are not so necessary. Because in this situation, it's not really necessary for me to be able to see this with such clarity. And if I can leave it out, I make the task a lot simpler for the people who produce the material. So we will now talk a little bit about the social aspect, the psychological aspects that come with it. One of them is cybersickness. You've of course heard about seasickness. Why do people get that? Because we find ourselves, there is a body balance within, and our brain constantly tries to orient ourselves with a surface, with a stability of some sort. When we walk, we're used to it. We recognize that the body moves and the brain is able to absorb it. But when we are being driven somewhere, or we're in a boat or something like that, we have a movement, but our body isn't experiencing normal mobility. And there's a disconnect that the brain finds difficult to decipher, which leads us to cybersickness, to seasickness. In the virtual field, cybersickness comes in because we are then moving our heads, doing things, and we're inside an immersive experience where we expect to be moving, but we're not moving. So again, our brain is being tricked, and in the process, it cannot decipher it properly, and we get these phenomena. One of the things that leads to it is a phenomenon called latency. This happens everywhere. There is always a tiny lag when there is a moving image, when there's sound, between when you see it and when you perceive it, and certainly between when it is being produced and when it's being recorded. Usually this gap in most situations is very tiny. When it comes to VR, we've actually got a problem because the whole thing is constantly having to reprocess itself, create a new image field, a new sound field as we move our heads, as we look up, down, as we focus forward, focus back. And if there is too great a latency between those experiences, then it adds to the cybersickness phenomenon that we talked about. That's about as much as we're going to talk about regarding the technology, but there is a catch. So far, what I've said implies that the higher the resolution, the more the processing power, the less the latency, the better the quality of the image will be. That is true, but up to a point. There is some very interesting phenomenon called uncanny valley. It was introduced by a robotics professor, Masahiro Mori, in the 70s. And he came up with a very interesting observation that as this simulation gets more and more and more real, there comes a time when it's so real that we get frightened. We then worry because all of a sudden we discover that this thing that is so real is actually not real. And we have a psychological problem dealing with that situation, because up till that point, we knew in our minds that that was the unreal world, we were experiencing it. But now, it's almost like you have a robot in front of you and you can't tell if it's a robot or a human being. And we find that very disturbing. Human beings finding unsettling. That's about as much as we're going to talk about on this session. I just wanted to give you an overall field, but what we will do is hopefully in our homework we'll go through AR, VR, and augmented virtuality. But what I'd like you to do is to look at some of these programs. We'll give you the link to the video that I showed you. I'm going to send you some other links. But what I'd like you to do is to imagine a story that you want to tell, which renders itself far more effectively in VR or in this augmented reality than it does through the conventional means. And there's a catch here. There is this assumption that VR is always better. It's not. There are times when traditional storytelling works a lot better, is more convincing, and gets the story across more powerfully. And as photojournalists, as journalists, it is our job to be able to use the right medium at the right time for the right story. And that is where the human skill comes in. When we are adept at going through all of those terrains and we know what works best at any particular time, we will be in the driving seat. We will decide what is right for a particular audience at a particular time for a particular story. Thank you.